So you may recall that states are for more global events in the game. So let's use a little imagination and imagine that our player is riding with their bicycle through a war zone. And every now and then a grenade or some kind of explosion happens close enough to them to mess with their hearing a little bit. So this is of course the classic shell shock sound, and we're going to create this state, which is to say that when one of these explosions occurs, all of the sounds in the game are going to be low passed. We're not going to hear any of the high frequencies for just a moment, and this is going to be a state change in the game. So let's go back to our Game Syncs tab, and we're going to change our state group to refer to a mental state. We'll refer to normal and shell shock. Now, unlike with switches, our next step is not to go back over here and create a container, but actually we're going to go over here and look at the master audio bus. And here in the master audio bus, you'll notice that there is a states tab. We can add our mental state, and you'll see that it populates right away with both of the states that we created. Now what this means is in the normal state, these are going to be the settings of the master audio bus, and in the shell shock state, these are going to be the settings of that same bus. And like we said, we want to have a low pass on everything. So let's create a voice low pass filter here. We'll set it to around 50, and we'll give it a try. Same as before, we can select the states button and select our state. Here the default is always none, and then we can set the state we want. And you'll notice that when we select that state, shell shock becomes apparent. And then we can come back out of it either by selecting none or by selecting normal, because normal is sitting at the default settings here. Now, the master audio bus is definitely the top level at which you could use states to affect every sound in the game, but it's certainly not the only way that you can do it. You remember that we created a sub-bus, ambiances, and this also has a states tab. So we could go in and we could remove this from the master ambience bus. Perhaps we only want things that are being routed to the ambience bus to be affected. Then we could add it here. In fact, you can add a state change to any level of any hierarchy in Wwise. We could add it at a container level in the actor mixer hierarchy, or you could even add it to an individual audio asset. Moreover, the States tab isn't the only place that you can use states to affect in-game events and Wwise sound triggers. In our actor mixer hierarchy, we can create a switch container, and we can actually set a switch container's switch group to a state group. So here we could select mental state if we wanted to, and instead of placing a default switch, we could place a default state, like normal. And now, this switch container acts just like it did when it was being controlled by a switch, only it is in fact being controlled by that same mental state that is affecting things on the bus level. So you could, if you wanted, switch specific in-game sounds like, say, the type of the explosion or whether or not an explosion plays, just by having that explosion container triggered by the mental state group. So let's try building that now. Inside our explosion state container, we have none, normal, which is the default, and shell shock. So what we want is that when none and normal are selected, nothing will play, so we'll leave these empty. And when shell shock plays, we want there to be an explosion triggered. So let's create our blend container to contain the explosion, and just go ahead and populate that. It sounds like this. And we want that to trigger only when the state changes. So let's just populate our explosion state container by placing the explosion under the shell shock in the assigned objects. And now let's see what happens when we select. Just like we looked at the switch container, the fact that we are in the step play mode means that this state container is not going to look for new information until it has stopped and been re-triggered, like so. If we want this to constantly be looking for information, we can switch over to the continuous play mode, and now, no matter what, if we suddenly have a bomb hit us, we don't need to stop and restart. This can be a constantly running event that will trigger an explosion every time one occurs. There's the one problem, however, that it cuts off suddenly when the state goes back to normal. You'll need to keep this in mind when you're designing your functionality, that the length of the explosion sound is going to have to be shorter than the time at which you want to pull out your shell shock state. Now, when I say pull out, of course, I mean not having a sudden switch. Let's just deactivate this for now by unchecking the box next to it and look again at the master audio bus where we can re-add that state. I just want to take a look at how we can start controlling the state changes effects. So imagine we are riding our bicycle, and we go down into shell shock, and you'll hear that there's a change. There is a default time of about 1 second where it is transitioning from the regular sound to what we've set up over here in the master audio bus, which is a low pass of 50. So if we want that to take less time or more time than a second, then we're going to have to create a custom transition. And you can do that over in the Gain Syncs tab. So let's go back to the mental state states game sync, and over here in the state group property editor, we can actually start customizing exactly how we want to move between different kinds of states. So start by selecting insert, and then we can select from where we want to go, say none to shell shock, and perhaps we want the same thing for normal to shell shock. And that particular transition, which is the sound of the bomb, we want this to be very sudden. You can see there's that 1 second default transition, but we want it to be much more sudden than that. So let's put it to 0.2 seconds. But when we recover from that shell shock, we don't want it to recover suddenly in 0.2 seconds. We want that recovery to happen a little bit more gradually and naturally. So then we would insert again, and we would say from shell shock to normal, from shell shock to none. And there we'll let it take a second or even longer than that. But in some situations, you're going to want to have that custom length go in both directions. If this was 2 seconds, say you wanted something to go down 2 seconds and then take 2 seconds to reach back to its normal state, that's what this checkbox is over here. Checking this checkbox will tell Wise that this transition time, say from none to shell shock and back again, you want both of those things to take 0.2 seconds. Now we can't check this checkbox right now. It's currently grayed out, and the reason for that is that we already have shell shock to none in the other direction programmed down here. But we can go ahead and delete this for demonstration purposes. And now you'll see that we have access to that checkbox. And by checking it, we will tell Wise that from none to shell shock and from shell shock to none, we want it to take 0.2 seconds. If we don't have this checked, then it will assume that from shell shock to none, we want to take the default 1 second. In our case, that is in fact what we want. If you use your imagination, states and switches cover a vast swath of different kinds of functionalities that you can create within Wise. They're incredibly useful, especially used conjunctionally, and you will notice that for some situations, either states or switches could apply. Just think of it this way. Is this something that you want to affect just a small number of game objects, or is this something that you want to affect a large number of game objects? Because remember that if you're using a switch container, you're going to have to manually code in the name of every single game object that you want affected by that switch. On the other hand, however, using a state means that you only have the ability to select a single state at a time and no game customization for a game object basis, and using a state has a tendency to use more CPU. So for the specific situations that you find yourself encountering, you can select the best option available to you.